Hello, my dear friends. Welcome. Thank you for joining me here. I'm Mari Theriger, and today I would like to address the Temple of Wotan, which in a few minutes I'll explain what it is for those who don't yet know what's this all about. I actually had in mind speaking about the similarities between Jesus, Yahshua, and Dionysus, Dionyson. Jesus being Dionysus in disguise. Because I've recently released a new album with my experimental solo music project called Varum, and one of the tracks, the third track to be more precise, is dedicated to Dionysus, and the lyrics are in ancient Greek and available at Bandcamp and soon on Varum's Instagram as well for anyone who wants to read the lyrics. It's a sort of nerd metal to anyone who is interested in listening to it. So, the video on the similarities between Jesus and Dionysus will be postponed. It was indeed just to announce my new album anyway, because Varum is much more important than Jesus. Well then, the Temple of Wotan, some of my patrons these past few years have also asked me questions concerning subjects that I know come in this literary work, the literary work Temple of Wotan, written by Ron McVan, and I have seen quite a lot of misconceptions concerning Old Norse society in general and pre-Christian Nordic beliefs circulating all over the internet, of course, and even here sometimes in some of my videos in the comments, in the comment section, and comments that still perpetuate those misconceptions, and I know the roots of such ideas have been expressed in this work. I have obviously answered my patrons countless times, actually, concerning this literary work by Ron McVan. And there's been recent questions again at my Patreon concerning this same subject. So, well, I have decided to make a video on it. So in the future, it will be easier for me to send the link to this video when the same doubts and questions surface again. So with no more delay, let's jump right away into this subject. As I said, the Temple of Wotan is a work written by Ron McVan, a prominent figure belonging to the white supremacist group Wotansvolk, which attempts to present itself as some sort of a spiritual guide to Germanic paganism, but is actually an ideological fan fiction disguised as Norse mythology. It's important to clarify that Ron McVan, it's not just a question of having no academic background in history or mythology of any kind, but also quite a lot of lack of knowledge on the history of pre-Christian Scandinavian societies and no real interest in actually knowing the sources, be those literary sources, historical, mythological, or archaeological. And in this work, the Temple of Wotan, he mixes invented rituals with racial discourse, proposing ideas such as that the spirit of Wotan is in the DNA of white people, and redefining the god Odin as a genetic symbol of the Aryan people. We have then his made-up rituals he claims to be or to have a Germanic ancestry. As an example, rituals such as static meditation or awakening the inner runic fire, which obviously lack historical foundations and seem more like a joke, something you would definitely see in comic books or fantasy novels or some such, and it is not, indeed, it has nothing to do with ancestral spirituality, but as a matter of fact, white supremacist propaganda. Rather than drawing on real sources like the Eddas or Scandinavian archaeology, Icelandic sagas, mythological and folklore accounts, etc., and so on and so forth, well, Ron McVan relies on a narrative of will to power and racial survival, where spirituality is conflated with physical strength and genetic supremacy. I must point out that the racial ideology of purity and supremacy in his work, this work we are talking about here, are not intended to be wide in the open, right? His work is precisely the aim is to pretending that these ideologies were present in the ancestral spirituality of the Nordic peoples and thus misleading people into holding supremacist and racial ideas because they are following and honoring the spirituality of their ancestors. Nothing in this book, absolutely nothing, is truly historical and or scientific. It is purely fiction created to express racism, supremacy, and racial ideas of racial purity. Despite all of this, and still nowadays, some people still use this source as if it were a reliable source of information on ancient Nordic spirituality and quoting from it to show proof and arguments to defend racial ideals as if they were present in ancient spiritualities. So it is not and never was and never will be a reliable source of information. And that is quite clear to anyone who actually knows, the basics of the vast historical and archaeological data we have concerning the belief systems of pre-Christian Scandinavia. Furthermore, in his book, he invents the 14 codes of Aryan ethics, completely detached from reality and not really taking into consideration what we truly know about the original, real Scandinavian Iron Age pieces of wisdom on ethics, morals, and even perceptions of the spiritual, just as we can have a little glimpse in a literary work, in the Alvamal, a real surviving literary source that truly gives us an idea about these subjects and about the mentality of late Iron Age Scandinavian belief systems, just in part, right? So he uses his work as a form of promoting exclusionary and xenophobic principles. In short, the Temple of Wotan is not a text about mythology, it's not a scientific source, it's not a study based on anything historical and scientific, despite of the attempts to be or to pose as such, but an ideological manifesto with a pseudo-pagan aesthetic which highly distorts Old Norse traditions and belief systems in favor of a racist narrative. Even for modern attempts to create new age perceptions of spirituality that never existed as it is often portrayed by new age religious movements, self-proclaimed or as paganism, this cannot even be considered that, right? This is, beyond a shadow of a doubt, a modern ideological manifesto. It's important to remind you that, unfortunately, it's not just a distortion of ancient spiritualities that these types of works provoke, as well as the spreading of misinformation and racist ideologies, but this work in particular also creates and perpetuates misconceptions about the old Germanic deity Wotan, and by consequence of the Scandinavian Odin. I'm sure you have asked yourself, just as my patrons did actually, that, why is the figure of Odin always quite appealing and invoked among white supremacists? Why is Wotan or Odin so popular among modern neo-Nazis who love to pretend to be Vikings? Wotan, and by consequence Odin, was kidnapped and stripped of its historical definitions, concepts, and meanings, and became a figure of modern racial ideologies to the point of the creation of Wotanism, a kind of mystical racial cult mixed with Germanic mythology, thrown in there and completely distorted to serve as a spiritual explanation of supremacism, with no small amount of pseudoscience that gives an intellectual look to it but has no true scientific basis. It's important to take note that David Lane, now a white supremacist American domestic terrorist and neo-Nazi, and one of the founders of the Wotansvolk movement, from which Ron McVan belonged to, the author of the racist manifesto, Temple of Wotan, spoken previously, right? If you still remember. He is the creator of a form of Odinism, which by itself is a modern New Age religion, but focused on the preservation of the Aryan race, further perpetuating misconceptions and racism by using the figure of Odin as a means to spread such ideologies through esoteric teachings. So it's to be expected that Ron McVan's work, Temple of Wotan, will only express the racial ideologies of the Wotan's folk movement, right? Returning to David Lane, he came to understand, as all of us have understood that, I think, that religion can be a powerful weapon if it becomes an identity. That's mostly what religion has been used for thousands of years. It is a weapon, it can be used as a weapon, and when people identify themselves with anything but with some religion, for this case as part of their cultural and societal integration within a system, will willingly fight and defend that identity, even if it's a new identity. As long as it is appealing and it serves to give the illusion of having a higher purpose, people will fight for what gives them meaning and a sense of worth and a sense of belonging, right? Or a sort of mission, a quest in this world. And the figure of Wotan and Odin is perfect to be used as a spiritual weapon, especially for supremacist ideals, being a deity linked to war, battle, soldiers, being of European historical background. And there's a certain mystical, esoteric appealing to Odin, especially through Jungian psychology, which is often misinterpreted and cherry-picked, right? Which is exactly what happened with David Lane and Ron McVan and their interpretation of Odin and how they passed that interpretation to others, right? They misread it. Jung was already talking about Wotan in 1936, right? But as a psychological symbol, not a military mascot. To Carl Jung, Wotan was a symbol used to understand and describe some aspects of the psychological mechanics of humanity, nothing more. Carl Jung wasn't pagan and he did not worship Odin or Wotan or whatever. And Carl Jung's psychological analysis using the god Wotan is often misread and misinterpreted, especially by white supremacists, conveniently. And this begs the question, why didn't they choose any other deity like Jupiter or Zeus, and Shiva, Ziva, or wherever, some other deity that presents similarities to Odin and just as easily can be misinterpreted to fit supremacist ideologies. Because Wotan is a lot more obscure, right? And sounds ancient. Odin's religious conceptions are obscure, shrouded in mystery. There isn't actually a lot to go by, as the sources do not present clear religious meanings to the god Odin, and it's absolutely open to interpretation and open to a lot of interpretations and inventions and misconceptions. But like I said, only some aspects of Odin are conveniently picked. White supremacists often forget, probably on purpose, the homosexual and transgender implications of the god Odin found in literary sources and archaeological sources as well. Odin himself is a foreign deity as well, as multiple studies show, not just to Scandinavia, but to Europe. In other words, Odin, Wotan, is an immigrant who entered Europe in the early Iron Age. Odin is also a god of sorcery, magic, and highly related to feminine sorcery. Among other aspects, white supremacists conveniently forget or fervently deny, obviously. And besides, almost no one is going to correct them because almost no one studies Norse mythology seriously. And those who do study Norse mythology seriously and whose work heavily relies on scientific evidences and the study of the actual sources will not obviously be invited to these people's gatherings because the figure of Odin to white supremacists has nothing to do with the actual Odin of the literary, mythological and archaeological sources. In fact, the real Odin, let's say, the historical Odin, in many aspects goes against the ideologies of white supremacy. And, there's many reasons why this ignorance pisses me off, but also it's very sad to distort Wotan or Odin and use it as a figure to express racist and supremacist ideologies. A highly complex deity, very contradictory in nature. Turning Odin into a cheap supremacist logo is so ignorant. Kidnapping Odin, owning Odin, a deity, and using this figure to pretend to know about the spiritual, when the historical spiritual conceptions that we truly know of Odin are highly complex, and there's much to the history of the figure of Odin that contradicts these New Age spiritual prejudices. Every ancient deity has thousands of cultural layers from very different historical backgrounds. To reduce the complexity of spiritual and mystic conceptions through time to a tiny fraction that by itself does not even correspond to the truth is such an enormous sign of raw ignorance. Anyway, I hope this video was useful. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And, as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Until we meet again, my dear friends.